Awesome. So, as a kind of little introduction to who Greg is and how I kind of know him, um, he's a transpersonal psychotherapist specializing in psychosynthesis. Um, and he has done work. He's been a psychotherapist for about 8 years now. I'm seeing clients for 8 years, and he's done work with Imperial College on um, their trials using psilocybin for a number of various things, and we will talk about that. But he was actually one of the therapists involved with those trials using kind of psilocybin as an assistance to psychotherapy. Um, that's a little bit of background about Greg, and I guess as a way of introducing kind of your work to everyone here, and maybe giving people a little bit of more context. I was wondering if you could give us kind of understanding of your approach to therapy and what role integration plays in that as well.
Yeah, well, I suppose, hello everyone, by the way. Yeah, I suppose the interesting thing about the word integration and what integration is, in some ways, in my belief, it kind of is therapy, It's like when you think about therapy and what you're doing, or what one is doing in therapy, you are sort of trying to excavate, like a sort of archaeological dig, little brushing off the bones, seeing what comes up, seeing what you can find.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a sort of sense when you're in therapy and kind of exploring in that way, that you are reclaiming lost aspects of yourself. And that reclamation is a sort of type of integration, because it's a kind of like, oh, hello, old friend, you're back, or getting in touch with bits of yourself that you don't like, or that you're ashamed of. And I suppose where that fits really beautifully with psychedelic therapy is that psychedelics will obviously show you your unconscious material very clearly, in some cases, and so therefore, you hear this kind of phrase about, like, it saves about 7 years of therapy. I'm a little bit careful about that, to be honest, because I think what that gives off to people is like, oh, I don't need to do therapy. I'm just going to go and take loads of psilocybin and I'll be okay. And actually, I'm sure we'll get to the study and the results of the study, but it's, what we're seeing is actually that the therapy is, implicit in part of the care, the helping the patient deal with whatever they're dealing with.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially the idea that kind of all therapy is in a way integrating different aspects of yourself. I was wondering if you could give people maybe a kind of brief overview of what psychosynthesis is as the kind of model or framework that you've used as a pathway into this work.
Absolutely. So psychosynthesis is a transpersonal model. So when we say transpersonal, what we're talking about is beyond the self. So, Saggioli, who was the founder of psychosynthesis, sort of famously said, psychosynthesis will lead you to the door. So what it means is that there's an acceptance, or there's a recognition of a spiritual dimension. Now, psychosynthesis doesn't go into what that is, or what that, or how that looks. I mean, there is theory behind it, but the main thing is that it's open to beyond the self, what is beyond ourselves. And so again, that fits really nicely with psychedelic therapy, because it's something about looking beyond the personal I, because in psychosynthesis, the model is an egg. The way that it's drawn, or the map, is an egg diagram with the higher self kind of pictured at the top of the egg. And then the mirror of that self is like the I, so the personal self. And then scattered all around that are our sub-personalities, all these parts of us that are sometimes in conflict. Some of them kind of get on well. But a really beautiful metaphor for it is the idea that within us, we all have an orchestra of players, all right? So you can imagine that you've got someone in your orchestra who's like shy and retiring, doesn't want to be seen, so they play really quietly. And then you've got the person in your orchestra who plays the kettle drums all the time and just wants to play over everyone else. And a whole range of parts of ourselves in between that. So, you know, another way of looking at that, and what I really love, is that sort of that idea of many gods, you know, sort of like the Hindu tradition, really. It's like we have these many gods or archetypes within us, and usually the sort of ego or this personality sort of wants to choose one part that is like the loudest or the most certain. And actually, through sort of psychosynthesis therapy, what we learn to do is to tune into the more nuanced voices and the quieter voices, and sort of bring them forward a little bit. So yeah, for me, before any kind of psychedelic therapy, you know, I believe that it's really good to have a good relationship with your therapist and be working for a little while beforehand, so you can kind of tune into who your players are, you know. And the other part that's very important to mention is that, you know, an orchestra is an orchestra, right? They could play, and it could sound great and it could sound horrible. But if you don't have a conductor conducting who needs to play when, then, you know, there could be a lot of dissonant sound or a lot of conflict. So the idea in therapy, really, or psychosynthesis therapy at least, is about developing that conductor within oneself. So it's slightly beyond the observer. It's being an observer, but an observer with will. So you can direct your attention to whoever within you needs attention. Does that kind of cover it?
Yeah, that's fascinating. I personally, I guess, to give the audience some idea, I'm very interested in studying psychosynthesis in greater depth, especially the way that I know Asagioli kind of split with Freud early on, because Freud was very concerned with what had happened in your past, and that there's a lot to be said for moving into the future from what happened in your past. So I'm personally fascinated in this model of psychology, so I'm also curious, as this is about psychedelic therapy and how all these things blend together, what was your path into psychedelic therapy? How did you kind of learn about it? Was this always something that was on your radar? And then ultimately, how did you get involved with the Imperial trials?
Wow. Okay. Well, it's a little bit of a story, actually, because I mean, to take the first part of your question, yes, my own use of psychedelics, my own experience with psychedelics. So I started very young. I must have been 16 when I took my first acid trip, you know, and I was, it's one of these things that's like, you know, it seems to be too easily available. I mean, that sounds so sort of fuddy-duddy, doesn't it? But it's like a 16-year-old taking psychedelics, or certainly my 16-year-old, when I took psychedelics, it blew my tiny mind. But that's the same thing. Is like I didn't even know who I was already, because I was only 16. So it's a kind of, I feel like I sort of went in too hard too soon. Do you see what I mean? So there was a sense that I wanted to try all these experiences of, you know, I had this kind of seeking some sort of spiritual ease, if you like. And that took the form of different psychedelics and different types of drugs. So I spent a lot of my sort of teens and the whole of my 20s experimenting, you know, just recreationally, really. That's not to say that there wasn't some sort of consciousness with it, but there was also an aspect of addiction in there. And I think it's really important to mention addiction, because many people talk about psychedelics and how psychedelics are not addictive. Now, that may be the case, but the problem is that we ourselves have addictive tendencies, right? So if there's something like an experience like LSD or mushrooms or something, and I have this absolute spiritual experience and I feel like I'm one with everything, And then I come back to my life and I'm, you know, chopping wood, fetching water, doing all the kind of mundane things that life, you know, keeps throwing at us. Then every now and then I'm going to want to keep going back to that experience of oneness. So rather than finding sort of, you know, ways of meditating or doing yoga or practices that bring us into that oneness or remind us of it, psychedelics just boom, take you straight there. So I had a bit of a problem with that. And in my early 30s, I ended up in a 12-step recovery program. Now, I sometimes joke about this because I spent 16 years in recovery, and I feel like that was my integration, right? So all the use that I was had of psychedelics before and all the drugs took me 16 years to integrate, because I realized that, you know, addiction is a sort of spiritual malady. You know, most people who take drugs are looking for that connection in some way. And so what was amazing about that, coming to the end of that recovery time, was I trained as a psychotherapist. I was aware, I had friends in the field of psychedelic therapy. And so I was able to come back to these substances in a sort of therapeutic manner, which has been an incredible journey, because it's different. But also what I think, and this is why I feel like I was called to the sort of psychedelic. It's not something that I actually consciously chose. You know, I didn't think, oh, I'm going to be a psychedelic therapist. You know, I was doing my MA at the Psychosynthesis Trust, and a couple of people in my group were doing their MAs on. One was doing ayahuasca, and one person was writing an MA on integration. And I was kind of talking to them going, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I used to take psychedelics. I was into all that stuff, but, you know, hadn't really thought about ever going back to it at all. So skip to the next part. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Michelle Baker-Jones. So she was basically an assistant guide on, no, she was a guide on the Imperial trials as well, along with Roz and many others. But anyway, she was an old friend of mine, and she said to me, why don't you come and check out this this sort of psychedelic therapy stuff? And I was like, well, I'm not really, you know, I wasn't that interested, to be honest. I just felt like, oh no, it's just a lot of people like trying to get off their heads and calling it therapy. so I just kind of ignored it. But then this is the part where I should tell you about my previous life. So in my previous life, I've spent 20 years as an actor. I was an actor. I did sort of film and television and stage. And, you know, I always had this hunger or thirst to find out what made people tick, why people were how they were. And so anyway, so cut back to where we are now. And I'm sitting there, and Michelle gives me a call, and she says to me, they're looking for an actor to come and play someone on psilocybin, because there's a guy called Bill Richards, who you might have heard of. Bill Richards is like the grandfather of psychedelic guiding. So he was famous for handing over the last dose of psilocybin before the prohibition. And anyway, so I had this opportunity to sort of go and meet Bill, have a chat with Bill, and then we did some filming, because they wanted to film Bill doing, you know, what he does best. So it was quite interesting, because I was there in the middle of my psychotherapy training. I was lying on a couch with an eye mask on, and I had Bill Richards sat by my side going, in and through, my boy, in and through, go in and through. And I was kind of, you know, having different experiences, you know, like a bad trip and this bit where I kind of wanted just to talk. And Bill showed through through his years of experience, how he would handle that in a guiding situation. So basically at the end of that filming session, I sort of said to him, well, listen, I'm training to be a therapist. Do you think this is something that would be, you know, a good thing to do? And he said, oh God, you're in exactly the right place to go for it. And it turned out that Roz Watts, who I'm sure most of you know, who was running the Imperial trials, was directing that piece of work between me and Bill. So she was kind of getting it all on film. And she said to me, why don't you come along to the guide training that we're doing? And I was like, I'd love to, absolutely love to. And the plan was that I was going to turn up and I was going to be an actor, so they could sort of show the trainees what it would be like if someone was like extremely paranoid, or someone was kind of really aggressive, something like that. And I sat there for 4 days, I think it was, and did the training, and kind of didn't really think much more about it. I thought it's really interesting. I was kind of really getting into the idea of it by then. And the next thing I know, Roz just gave me a call and said, hey, listen, do you want to join the team? And I was like, yeah, I would absolutely love to. So that's the way it happened. It's strange, isn't it? I wasn't looking for it, but it unfolded in that way. And very much this is, the connection I make with that is, everyone's aware of mycelium, right? The mycelium that runs under the ground that connects everything, so trees can talk to each other, and and it's the sort of this, and every now and then a mushroom pops up, but the mycelium is the thing. And all I could imagine is that the mycelium had called me, it pulled me in. And I'm extremely grateful for it. It was a real experience working there.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that little story. I mean, it does seem how there's a lot of synchronicities that kind of come together in the right way to, open doors where doors didn't exist before. But so you did, I really want to learn more about what actually went on at Imperial and how they conducted their trials, and in what capacity, like what does a psychedelic session actually look like inside of a clinical room? And
okay.
So yeah, what's kind of happening there?
Okay, so the actual psychedelic experience itself involves turning up on the day. So it's in a hospital. We were at Hammersmith Hospital. No, we weren't at Hammersmith Hospital. We were out in Acton at the Imperial. Yeah. And basically the patient would come in. By this point, we've already had some prep days, and we've kind of been going through, what to expect, or how they're feeling, what they need, what they want to ask from the experience, and all this kind of thing. So we've already had a lot of contact hours with the patient. Anyway, on the day of the dosing, so they turn up, and as I was saying to you a little bit earlier, the really nice bit would, the pills would arrive. So there's this little medical bottle with psilocybin written on the outside, and the patient would undo them. We'd pop in these little 6 pills into their bowl, and we'd have a little kind of ceremony, if you like. And then the patient would take the pills, and they would either be a 25 milligram dose of psilocybin, a 1 milligram dose of psilocybin. And so they were either going to get the large dose or the small dose, right? And we didn't know what they were getting. I was kind of laughing to myself, because every patient I worked with seemed to be high dose, and it was pretty obvious. I didn't need to ask them really. It was kind of pretty obvious that they were having experiences. Anyway, so what we would do is, for the first half an hour, we'd sort of sit and we would look at artwork, in books and things like that, and we'd just chat, and everything would be quite easy and very calm and low key. Lovely lighting in the room, lots of rock salt lamps, lots of in the Imperial room we had this big kind of forest scene that went around the whole room. I mean, you could still tell it was a hospital room, right? They had all the kind of strange telephones and machines whirring away. Anyway, so the patient would lie on the bed, and they would put on their eye mask, and we'd put headphones on for them, pre-selected playlist, and we would basically sit back. So at that point, when we've given them the pills, we've stepped away from being therapists. We're now, aircraft crew. We're there to sort of sit back and keep an eye on everything that's going on in the room. And if the patient needs any help, such as someone holding their hand, or we found lots of different interventions. Sometimes we found that patients had a lot of pressure, you know, that they wanted to sort of push away somehow. So we would offer them resistance, you know, we'd like put a towel over their chest, something like that, and they could push against it, you know, really kind of get that catharsism, you know. So it was beautiful actually, because we had this group, supervision group with Dr. Tim Reed was supervising us, and he comes from a sort of holotropic, Stan Groff's holotropic breathwork kind of lineage. So he was really useful in that way, you know, because the other part of it was that we were kind of learning on the job as well, you know. So we realized there were certain questions that if you ask someone, it only really sort of takes them into a little narrow cul-de-sac of answers, you know. So there was a sort of way that we had to approach asking them how they were doing, you know, sort of making it a little bit more specific, perhaps something like, how's your body? What's going on in your body? Something like that. Because most people, you ask them how they're doing, they go, yeah, good, thanks, you know, and they just shut up. So then we just basically check in with them, you know, every half hour or so, every hour, we just put a gentle hand on them and sort of say, you okay? Everything all right? And they go, yeah, you know, or I'm not really feeling anything, or wow, you've turned into a, you know, one guy was like, oh my God, you're a goblin. You've turned into a goblin. You know, and basically, so we'd spend 4 to 6 hours in this tiny little room in the Imperial College, you know, no natural light, quite strange. And the patients would go through their experiences, and yeah, it was quite an incredible thing to be with. You know, there's long days, you know, sat there, because a lot of the time when someone's in there, got their eye mask on or headphones on, they're just in their world having their experience. They don't really need you, you know. So a lot of the practice of being a guide really is about being able to sit back and be patient and not looking things to happen, you know. So it's like just being calm, having a little meditate, just checking in, taking notes. And that's kind of as simple as it needed to be, really. And then 3 weeks later, they would come back and then do it again. We'd do it all over again.
See, yeah, it's really interesting how, I mean, in my mind, because these are like you said, like funded trials from a very prestigious university trying to figure out the efficacy of these substances over controls or placebos. And it's interesting how there's so much like experimentation going on in the moment, with trying to figure out what might actually help this particular client
Uh-huh.
with their particular blockages or things that they've been through. So it's interesting that you almost can't standardize everything about the procedure, and I'm sure that makes it kind of difficult to do quote hard science on these kinds of experiences.
Yeah. Well, I mean, have you read the paper that's come out a couple of days ago? There's, I mean, what we're seeing obviously is that there's a kind of, you can't really separate the therapy from the actual experience or the care that's given. And I think that's quite telling in some ways, because, you know, the problem is that psilocybin, you know, however amazing it is, if it becomes just another pill to pop to get better, then you know, the inspiration of it kind of, I think it could just go. Do you know what I mean? It could just become another pill, another antidepressant. You know, so in some ways, I'm quite glad of the results in terms of what we're seeing between the control, the people that took the too high doses, or the escitalopram, the SSRI. Actually, in most cases, everyone had an improvement, and really, I think that comes down to the level of care they were given and attention. And of course, psilocybin is incredible and has an effect, and yet what we see is that even 6 months later, people are still depressed. So it's not the magic bullet. It's not it doesn't like cure depression. And this is the thing, you know, this is what we're seeing in integration is that, and in therapy, is that it's more about how you start to work with yourself, you know, how you take care of yourself, how you bring in that element of self-love. And, you know, antidepressants are very advanced these days, so they do, you know, they do work to a certain degree, and the same with psilocybin obviously works, and yet it's not a kind of cure-all magic bullet thing. It's not like, oh, that's it, it's all over. You know, there needs to be, and I think this is a wider question about healthcare, and, you know, is that actually, yeah, you could give people antidepressants and say, right, see you later, or you could give them antidepressants and show them some care and give them some therapy, and maybe something, you know, I haven't got anything against CBT therapy, but maybe something a little bit more depth psychology, so people can actually make those lasting changes, you know. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
No, that's a really good point, and I'm happy that you mentioned the recent study that came out. I think it was published last Wednesday in the New England Journal of Medicine from Imperial, which was with psilocybin versus escitalopram, which is an antidepressant. So it's a really fascinating study, and it wasn't too. The results weren't like sensationalized, or they weren't. There wasn't an incredible difference, which is actually good for showing that this is perhaps an alternative to those types of like just psychiatric care. But I was wondering that after these people had these experiences and you're in the room with them, what did the integration look like from these experiences, and how did, because that really seems where the work is actually happening. Like you can have a kind of transcendent experience where you meet God or something. Like if you take DMT, it's like a tiny 10-minute experience that's incredibly intense, but there's very little that you can really bring back from that. So what did the integration look like, and how did you kind of approach that?
So as I said before, what we've been doing is the lead up to the actual experience itself were prep sessions. So a lot of the team were doing kind of Zoom calls and things like that to kind of you know, do all the assessments, make sure that the participant was right for the study, and then what happened was they came down to London, and we would spend usually a day together, talking about everything about the experience, and then they'd have the experience, and then the day after we would meet again the next morning. So the patient would stay on site, and then so that morning we would just spend the whole morning just kind of going in, you know, because sometimes participants shout things out or they say things that, you know, you take a note of. So we kind of go through everything that had happened or everything that happens on the experience, and just kind of see if it reminds them of anything, or it connects to anything. So this is more of the point where we come in as therapists. You know, it's like, okay, so there's a little bit of trying to understand what's going on here, a little bit of the kind of nuancing, the sort of brushing of the bones, if you like. So yeah, so that would be really useful, I think, for the participant to kind of find connections and make sense of certain aspects of it. But that doesn't mean that the whole thing made sense. But the bits that we could make sense of, we would make sense of, and the rest of it we would kind of hold, you know, it lightly and see if it revealed anything later on. So after that, they would have connection basically whenever they really needed it or wanted it. So there was a kind of setup. I think it was like twice a week to start with, but if they ever needed any more support, they could get in contact with one of the guides and they could have a session. Excuse me. And so what they would do, you know, so each participant basically from start to finish ended up with about 35 hours to 40 hours of therapeutic intervention, which is you know, if you think about it, it's a kind of year's worth of therapy, really, over a very sort of short time. And that whole space was just created for making sense, making meaning, holding the emotion that would come up, because obviously when people kind of get in touch with their early trauma and things like that, you know, then they're dealing with life with that experience. Now I've got this trauma and I'm aware of it, rather than I'm keeping it locked down and depressed away. It's actually coming up, and now what? You know, and that's, you know, I often say to clients when they first turn up, I say, you know, part of this experience of doing therapy is going to be about like unraveling. It's not just going to be like, oh yeah, you're all good, right now, you're better, off you go. It's like, we're going to need to unravel a little bit, and and it might feel like you're falling apart a little bit, because you're undoing the usual routes to how you do life. So yeah, they got a lot of time and a lot of connection. And then also the other thing that we found is really important is that they all joined a kind of WhatsApp group, their own WhatsApp groups of the other participants. And yeah, so we're finding that the actual connection for other participants, being able to talk to each other. And this is where I think, you know, the 12-step model comes in perfectly, because if you think about the 12-step model and actually just the sharing, you know, I always used to joke in meetings about, God, everyone needs this, you know, even if you're a drinker or a smoker or whatever, and you're just trying to, you know, everyone could do with coming and sitting in a circle and getting some kind of connection with other human beings and realizing that they're not alone, you know. And so, you know, a lot of credit to Ros Watts, because she went on to work for Synthesis now, and that's what she's created, the connectedness program in Synthesis, which is a year-long commitment to participants who want to come. And you know, we meet weekly with all the other participants. Every month there's a tree workshop, you know, so it's all about getting back to nature. But the most incredible part of that is just that you've got, you know, 8 to 12 people turning up every week and checking in with each other. And just that in itself, I feel like, is incredibly therapeutic, you know?
Yeah, that's a really good point, that a lot of the transformation that comes out of like psychedelic therapy is just because people are getting a lot of therapy, and that's transformative in itself. And it sounds like, well, I'd also like to mention that we have a speaker on Thursday who's working with the Synthesis Institute right now, Dr. Sam Gandhi.
Oh yeah, Sam, yeah.
Yeah, so he's going to be talking about some of his work with kind of helping to design some of those that ecology that's built into Synthesis. So please tune in later if you're interested in that. I'm speaking to the entire audience.
Yeah.
But kind of back to the way that psychedelics interact with therapy. It sounds like they're kind of working as a catalyst towards kind of speeding up a process that might already be occurring if you do enough therapy or deep enough. But so what do you think is the kind of the unique benefit of using psychedelics in tandem with the therapeutic practice?
I think, you know, in a sort of most simplistic kind of way, it's like having a dream and then going to therapy and talking about what your dream means. Now, I know that's really simplistic, but what we find with psychedelics is that, you know, the brain, as we know, is an incredible machine, right? Or organic matter, but it's got this incredible way of kind of making paths, making connections, and kind of realizing that this is the way that we do things. Now, what psychedelics do is kind of come in and just kind of go poof, and light up the whole brain. And it's kind of like, I think Robin Carhart Harris described it as a sort of snowfall on a mountain. So if you go to the top of a mountain and it was Michael Pollan, wasn't it, who described it that way. So, you know, if you go to the top of the mountain and you go and you ski down the same route every time, then you're going to end up in the same place. So what psychedelics do is they sort of allow there to be a snowstorm, and then you can choose a different path. You know, it's like, oh wow, I'm here and I can go down this path, or I can go down that way, or I can go this way. Now, so what we're talking about there on a kind of neuroscientific level is brain plasticity and how we can change our we can light up the default mode network and change the way that we think. Now, you know, that's all very well. We can do that, and a psychedelic will do that. But usually, when we come down from a substance like that, we kind of slip back into that old way of thinking, or slip back into old patterns. And that's where I believe therapy and integration groups are so helpful, because they allow us to keep it fresh and allow us to remember the lessons and the you know, the blessings of this experience, and therefore we change the way that we respond in life.
Yeah, that's awesome. I completely agree with that. So I think I'll probably be able to ask you two or three more questions from the ones that we prepared, and then we can open it up to
Sure.
audience live questions. Most of these questions, by the way, were actually polled from the audience about 2 weeks ago. We did an Instagram live, so this is kind of already a representation of what people wanted to hear. But I'm really curious to hear your perspective on challenging psychedelic experiences and the benefits that they might be able to hold for our own personal psychological, but also spiritual development. Like, yeah, what is your perspective on the quote bad trip?
Yeah. Well, I suppose there's a few different angles. You know, I think the difficulty with, you know, you could the sort of one angle is basically taking it at the wrong time with the wrong people in the wrong place. You know, so as I was talking about earlier, my 16-year-old self thought it'd be a great idea to take a purple microdot and go to the pier disco with all my mates and whatever, you know, and it's just, you know, maybe another time that would be a great idea, but at that point it was a really bad idea. And, you know, because you're opened up and everything's opened up, it's like, wow, I can't, you know, everything becomes too overwhelming. And so therefore it becomes like a bad trip, because it's suddenly there's a lot of self-judgment, or you're judging yourself through other people, or, you know, especially if you're an empath, someone who takes care of other people, you're very aware of what's going on around you, outside of you. And that can become really distracting and really overwhelming and quite hard, you know, because it feels like all the projections that you're putting onto people are sort of coming back at you, and you can feel it, and it feels like it's just too much. So the other part of it that's important to mention, I think, is kind of spiritual, what's called spiritual emergency, you know. So spiritual emergency can come about many different ways. Psychedelics could be a trigger for that, you know. I've worked with people who have been sort of taking ketamine for quite a long time, and what happens is there's a sort of gradual slip into a sort of a spiritual emergency, but without realizing it. It's sort of the gentle this idea that, oh yeah, I've kind of got the answer, I kind of know what's happening here, I know how life should be, and then then becoming kind of very special in oneself, you know. So there's that aspect to it as well. But, you know, having a massage could trigger that. So coming back to the psychedelics, I think, you know, if you've got the opportunity and you can do it therapeutically, then really there's kind of no such thing as a bad trip. It's more that there's some really challenging material in here, and, you know, if I'm lying on this bed in a hospital room or in some sort of you know, licensed practitioner's office, then you know, it's still going to feel as scary. I might go to that place where I feel like I'm gonna die. I've lost my ego, you know, my ego dies, and I don't know who I am or where I am, or I think I've died already, you know. And the personality finds that really hard to deal with. It just can't deal with it. So that's, you know, there used to be Terence McKenna talks about the heroic dose, you know, 5 grams of mushrooms in a dark room with no music or anything. Now that seemed quite harsh to me, or quite challenging, but I think what he's part of the reason for going for the heroic dose is because sometimes with psychedelics, if you go in a little bit, or you're only half in and you're not very experienced, then the ego can still manipulate what's going on. And so you get this kind of half place where you're sort of in the psychedelic universe, but the personality can't make sense of it. And I think that can be very challenging as well. So, I know a lot of people talk about microdosing now. So I think microdosing could probably be quite a positive way of going, because it's imperceptible, So even if it's placebo, it doesn't really matter. It's kind of giving you that feeling that you're taking steps towards, or you're looking for something in yourself that could free up, But with microdosing, there's not really a chance of having a bad or challenging trip unless you take too much. So, which is, I've heard happening as well. So yeah, I hope I'm answering your question, but what I'm trying to say really is that the most important part of it is setting up the space for yourself, preparing, making sure that if you do have someone there who's going to help, a trip sitter with you, that you really trust them, that you feel that they can hold the space for you. And also, coming back to what Bill Richards was saying, it's like, trust, let go, and be open, and go in and through it. This idea that, what can feel like presence is coming into your psyche and kind of challenging you. Do we turn around and look back at them and kind of go, why are you here in my psyche? What are you doing here? And, Bill would say, go into the eyes, go into its eyes. The other thing about taking psilocybin sort of if you're not experienced and you're taking it home on your own, what usually will happen is that you'll put some nice lights on and put some nice music on and get all comfortable and sit and take the dose. And then something slightly challenging comes up into your awareness, and you suddenly have this thought about yourself, or you have a thought about something in your life. And the next thing you know, you're up changing the music or turning the lights off or changing room or doing something else. And that's what usually happens with people taking it at home on their own, is that they find things to distract themselves away from the horrible bit. And with the therapeutic approach, what we're aiming to do is stay with it, even though it feels gnarly or it feels threatening or it feels like it could eat you or you're going to die or something like that. The invitation is to stay with it. Even if we'll just sit here and hold your hand, you're going to be absolutely fine. Just go into it, go into the experience. And usually you go into something like that, it relieves, it resolves in some way. So yeah, that's how I would talk about bad trips, I guess.
Yeah, that's excellent. I love those, those lines, in and through, and then go into the eyes. I like that. If it's really intense, go into the eyes.
Yeah.
I really like that. So I'm wondering now that we're kind of into like a more practical space, what are some resources that you think are helpful for someone that is, has either had a really challenging experience or wants some support in terms of integration, but maybe isn't ready to go into therapy? Like, are there any practices that we can do, like just personally or with others, maybe joining groups or something?
Yeah, joining the integration groups is really good. I can see Rich Jones is here, the Psychedelic Integration Group in London. So that's a great resource. We've also got a group down here in Brighton that we run, and they're all over the world now anyway. I think you can just join on Zoom. The whole lockdown's given us this kind of a capacity to join meetings all over the world. But yeah, first of all, if you can face it, go to an integration group and try and either listen just to what's going on, what experiences people have had, or if you feel up for it, express what you need to express, and then see if you can get any feedback. There's so many other ways to approach integration. I sort of feel like I could just give you a list. I mean, journaling. I don't know if you've ever journaled, but journaling is just an incredible resource anyway. you know. And again, that's kind of where it connects to the 12-step recovery, because it's all about just keeping an eye on the quality of your inner thoughts. And the amazing thing about writing it down is that you can actually have a conversation with yourself. So, you know, as soon as you write it down, you kind of know what the quality of that thought is. It could be an undermining thought or a negative thought, or it could be a positive, whatever. But the beautiful thing about writing something down is it kind of reflects back to us what we were feeling when we wrote that down. So it's a beautiful mirror. What we're seeing in the synthesis program is that, you know, well, I mean, Ros Watts developed the ACE model, you know, so acceptance, compassion, and body. And what we're seeing with that is just that there's a kind of, you know, like with any therapy or any experience, it's when we try and disregard it, or when we try and push it away or depress it away, that it becomes a problem. So the whole acceptance part of anything that we're going through in life is really useful, to be able to accept it. Even if we're having a shit day, it's like, I'm having a shit day, you know, I don't need to feel any different than this. But if I can label it as I'm having a shit day, then I know that I'm just having a shit day, you know. And this is all part of like finding that acceptance of oneself, even though like even whatever's happening in life will just happen, you know. So what we're also seeing is that you know, the connectedness program is all about connection to other people. You know, we live in a society where we're also isolated and disconnected, especially after this year, you know. I mean, what's been incredible is that we've all been connected online, which is kind of, you know, it's kind of crumbs from the table, isn't it? But it's still connection. And you know, the sort of underlying philosophy behind that is that we're human beings. We are, you know, what psychedelics will show you ultimately, we are all one. You know, we are all one. So in this kind of like separate experience that we're having, you know, we can stay in that separate experience going, oh no, I'm on my own, I am alone, I am lonely, I am an island, I am isolated. And where that takes us is into, you know, well, you can see what's happening in society. It's like, you know, we've all moved out of the villages into the cities. And because the cities are there's so many of us, we can't have a relationship with every single person. We can't be connected to every single person. So community and connection is one of the most important things, I would say. And alongside that, I would also say that nature is one of the biggest healers. It's like, it's just so I sort of smile when I say it, because it's so obvious. You know, we all know what it means to go out for a walk and how that kind of enhances and inspires our life. You know, and I think when we're depressed, it's hard to do that, because you feel outside is outside. I don't want to go, you know, like I'm not inspired to do that. You talk to depressed people and you sort of say, okay, let's do some breath work. Let's do some meditation. Let's do this, you know, and it's like, oh, it's like, who's that guy pushing the boulder up a hill, you know, that is constantly coming round and up. It constantly feels like that. So all you can really hope for with any of these tools is that something kind of leaks through that allows that connection to happen. And then you start making good decisions for yourself, you know, healthy decisions. What shall I eat today? How am I going to exercise? How can I stretch my body? Can I be in nature today? Can I be in contact with other people today? You know, and that's the invitation. That's what we're, you know, that with or without psychedelics, you know.
Yeah, that was really well said. Thank you. And it really picks up on what Dr. David Fawcett was saying in our previous talk about the opposite of addiction, not being sobriety, but connectedness and being connected.
Yeah.
And so I really like that. That's so applicable in so many ways. So I really invite everyone in the chat to drop any questions you have. Let's see if there are any there now. All right. So someone has said, I know many people who have gone through a phase of overdoing it on DMT because of its nature. It calls you to return to the experience over and over again, which can become problematic. how can people avoid misuse when it pertains to psychedelics?
That's such a good question. Well, I think really it's about honesty, isn't it? You know, what are you looking for? What are you looking for? You know, I think there are many among us who are sort of like sort of the Indiana Joneses, you know, of the sort of psychedelic world, or even just the drug world or whatever. And it's about pushing boundaries or kind of going, seeing as far as you can go, that kind of thing. Now, that's all well and fine, do you know what I mean? But I think in terms of the reapproaching that experience, again, it's not the DMT, is it? It's your relationship to the DMT. So if the DMT is giving you something for 10 minutes, then that's absolutely fine, you know. But then if you come back and you're just living your life, and then you're thinking, oh, I might just do it again next week, or I'll do it again tonight, or whatever, then you know, it's a little bit like Ram Dass talks about, you know, Ram Dass, the Richard Alpert, the Harvard professor. You know, it's like that thing of we, you know, even if it was cigarette, say it was a cigarette, it's like, okay, we'll smoke the cigarette, but do it consciously, knowing that you're smoking it. And hopefully you can bring some consciousness to that where you sort of feel like, oh, why am I doing that? What am I doing that for? I feel like it's the same approach with DMT. It's like, yeah, it's an incredible substance, but let's look at our own relationship to it. Why am I chasing this experience? Am I trying to opt out of life so I can just kind of go, yeah, hey, like I know we're all one. You know, I mean, I don't think we really need to be doing loads and loads of DMT all the time. You know?
Yeah, I concur. Annie, I think you asked that question if you'd like to respond.
Yeah, thank you for your response. It was very interesting. Yeah, no, I've known many people who went through kind of I think it was a big phase, maybe like 5 or 6 years ago of ordering DMT off of the dark web, and it was very cool and like, you know, very I think the attitude towards it was like, yeah, this is a drug that's like, it gets you so fucked up, like you don't even know who you are. And I was like, doesn't that seem like something you should respect, you know? But no, I saw a lot of people misuse it and a lot of people abuse it. And those were people with pre-existing problematic usage of drugs, of other drugs.
Exactly.
So it was probably not the best idea, but you know, it's I think it was a good experience for them.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. It can be a good experience. It's just looking at your intention. You know.
Yeah, that was another thing that was spoken about earlier in our conversation on addiction was intention, about how important that is in what you're doing. So yeah, thank you.
Pleasure.
Awesome. The next question I think plays into what you were talking about with spirituality, and there's a line that comes to my mind from Ram Dass. No, not Ram Dass. You were talking about Ram Dass. Alan Watts.
Alan Watts, great, yeah.
Alan Watts used a fair amount of LSD and I think other psychedelics as well. But he had this saying, because he was also very deeply involved in Buddhism, and he was quite the scholar of like the Chinese texts and things like that. He lived in Japan for a while, but he said that when you get the message, hang up the phone.
Yeah.
Like stop ringing the same number, because it's just going to mess you up. Basically, you got the message. But the question here is, Hassan said, personally, I felt like spirituality played an immense role in integrating my psychedelic experiences. I imagine doing that in a clinical setting would be quite difficult. Was there any emphasis on spirituality with the aftercare?
I think it wasn't kind of overt, if you like. Even though what we're doing is basically setting up everything that we can in order for them to have a spiritual experience. Some people you just can't say spiritual experience because they'll just be whatever, you know. So I remember a couple of participants who were very sort of pragmatic, of the world type participants, and the whole spiritual thing was just like not interested. So you know, much like we were saying about psychosynthesis at the beginning of the talk, or of the questions, is like, we can lead you to the door of spirituality, but from there on, it's up to you. I can't, you know, the other thing is as well, is like that any spiritual practice that you may have is just another method. So in some ways, that method is always going to die at some point. It's going to break down. It's not going to work anymore. It's like that sticker that you put on the fridge saying, wake up, you know, to remind yourself to be awake. And after about a week, you just don't see the sticker anymore. You know, so it's a bit like that. It's like whatever our spiritual practice is, whether we're meditators or 5-rhythmers or, you know, Wim Hofers, you know, any of these things that kind of bring us back to into ourselves, you know, they're all really incredible ways of integrating. And yet, again, coming back to the Alan Watts thing, you know, he talked about how, you know, a spiritual emergency is basically like the ego chasing spirit up a spiral staircase until the spirit can't go any further. And then the ego thinks that it's God, you know. So there's many traps even on the spiritual path, you know. So I think what's beautiful and what psychedelics kind of show us is that, yeah, a spiritual practice is probably the best way to go in terms of how you come back to yourself daily. The methods that you create for yourself to come back into awareness, come back into love.
Yeah, and something that comes up for me is like back to Ram Dass, actually. I mean, that was kind of his path, right? He was not only an incredibly successful psychologist, he's a professor at Harvard, but he was thrown out of Harvard because of doing experiments with undergraduates and with psilocybin. And then his whole thing was he kind of kept coming down, right? And he couldn't stay in that place with psychedelics. And then he discovered his like spirituality, and that was, yeah. And then that's why we know him as Ram Dass. So it is really interesting how there is like a confluence of these kind of paths, but yeah, one seems to always be the more stable and consistent one, and the other is almost a doorway into that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I could imagine though, you know, it's that thing of like, you know, you could meditate every day for 40 years, couldn't you? And sort of, it's what I love about Ram Dass is the fact that he talks about, you know, you could sit meditating for 20 minutes a day for 40 years, right? But actually what you're doing there is you're kind of going, right, here's my 20 minutes of spirituality. I'm going to do that there, and then I'll just get on with my life over here. Whereas, you know, the invitation really is, isn't it, to become aware and become conscious in every moment. So psychedelics, I believe, is just one, you know, it's another tool for that. It's like, oh, right, I'm really conscious, I'm really aware of myself. Wow. You know, and it's another method that fades away, and he comes down, like you say, you come down. So any other method to consciousness, you know, is also can be as helpful and unhelpful if it's done consciously or it's just done as a kind of habit, you know. It's like...
Yeah, absolutely. So if anybody has any more questions, please drop them down there. I may have missed some actually.
Yeah, I would say I have to just bring it up. I would say, you know, we need more karmic yoga. You know, we need to take these spiritual practices or the things that we might learn in psychedelic experiences and pull them into the real life and the mundane.
I mean, interestingly, you just reminded me, because there was a moment when, before we did the trial, I wanted to try out the model of having guides on a psilocybin. So I kind of thought I'd be a participant and see what it was like. So I remember kind of lying down and taking the dose and putting the eye mask on, putting the headphones on, everything. And after about an hour, I was like, I need to do some yoga. I need to stretch. I need to be in my body. And what psychedelics always seem to remind me is like, lighten up, man. Get into your body and lighten up. You're already here. You're already cooked. You're fine as you are. You know, and I think this is where we get caught in a little bit of a trap with any method to consciousness, in psychedelics or yoga or meditation, whatever. We hold it out there as a carrot, in front of us and kind of go, right, when I get there, I'll be okay. What I love, something I've been practicing recently is yoga nidra. What yoga nidra is really good for is to remind you to rest back into yourself. It's like all that you are and all that you can be and all your potential is already in you. You're already here. One experience in you, even if it might be hidden, is your enlightened self. So all we're trying to do is tap back into it, getting through the layers of defense and years of whatever. And it's like, oh yeah, I'm already here. I'm already cooked. I'm already baked. If I can relax into that, then I'm okay. I find my acceptance. Is with any kind of method that we put out there, out front of us, it just becomes like we're chasing something, Yeah, more karma yoga.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I guess one thing that is coming up for me is that psychedelic therapy does almost seem to be that kind of carrot that people are chasing now. It's getting a lot of steam. There's a lot of publicity around the efficacy of these drugs and the therapies that use them, which I think is wonderful. But there is also a little bit of that perhaps like panacea vibe of, oh, I can just kind of do a couple sessions and then I'll be good. What do you think is the future of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy in terms of how it can really be effective in transforming kind of the current model of therapy?
What I would like to see is retreat centers. I see that, at any given moment, now we're at lockdown, we can go on retreat, right? We can go and do a 10-day Vipassana, we can go and do a yoga retreat, we can go and do a psychology retreat, anything you want to do, you can go and do it. I feel like psychedelics need holding in that kind of space. It's, if I just go down if I get prescribed psilocybin and I go down to the pharmacy and take it, maybe some people react well to that. But my absolute fear, as I said before, is it just becomes another disappointing SSRI. So I feel like what is needed is the holistic experience, and what that looks like, I imagine, is going to some sort of nature retreat, maybe up somewhere like Bohn up in Wales, somewhere like that. Connected with other people, doing some psychotherapy work on oneself, some process work, doing some yoga, a bit of meditation, some beautiful food. I mean, anyone's going to feel great after that week anyway, aren't they? But within that week, then there can be sort of a couple of psychedelic experiences that then can be processed in the group. That would be my vision for the future. I feel like that way people would be able to make the most of it, and also that would allow people to offer a range of, you'd get the kind of off to Jamaica to do like the high end retreats, or synthesis. I think it's like $9,000 or something like that, to maybe, like someone who's very experienced with psychedelics, and some people on the team who are like maybe psychotherapists, some other people who are yoga teachers, and come and be held in that gentle way, And I feel like that would be transformative.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. And it seems like that could be where things are moving, although they are moving fairly slowly, which I suppose you don't want to rush something like this, because I mean, I guess kind of bringing it back to Bicycle Day in the first place, there was an incredible amount of research done before Prohibition hit in like 1970, I think it was. And, there was a lot of progress being made into, I believe it was called the psycholytic paradigm of using psychedelics or substances in assistance with these therapies. And people like Stan Grof, who you mentioned, ended up developing his own method of getting people into these states without psychedelics. So I guess it's important to go cautiously and steadily. But so I guess I have one kind of final question, which is maybe even more political. I know there's a company called Compass Pathways who had a huge valuation recently, and they've tried to kind of do something like, at least from what I know, is kind of try to patent certain aspects of the therapeutic experience. I was wondering if you could kind of talk about that and maybe give your perspective on it.
Are you talking about the room setup itself?
Yeah, I think that's what I was reading about.
I mean, I just find that unbelievable. You know, that it's like, hang on a minute. So we put a rock salt lamp in the room. We have to put this up here. We put this, you know, nice paintings around or whatever. I really don't understand what they're trying to claim there, you know. I mean, maybe I should do a little bit more research, and maybe it's a little bit more nuanced and more specific. But to try and, I think you're right in terms of the dangers. Is what could happen here is that big pharma could get hold of this and sanitize it. You know, it's kind of what's happened. It happens with everything, doesn't it? It's like we find some method to consciousness, and then if it comes through to the masses, we have to sanitize it so much because of all the risk assessments that suddenly the magic's taken from it, you know. And I sort of feel like I'd love to understand more why Compass have thought that they need to patent the actual room setup, you know. It just seems a bit ridiculous to me. You know, I feel like the psychedelic space itself is about sharing, connection, community, and so to suddenly like ring fence an aspect of it, it's a little bit like, okay, that's interesting. What's going on there then?
Yeah, I suppose I bring it up because for anybody that isn't aware of that, there are interesting energies and forces coming into play with this quite new paradigm of therapy that there is a lot of monetary and financial interests, and different companies are doing different things. But I guess my last question, and we can maybe end on this, is if you have any specific books or resources or things that you think might help give people an additional pathway into learning more about this kind of work, or things that have actually had the biggest impact on you.
Yeah.
Do you see the question that was like, have you found any religious bias? Because I want to know the answer to that before we end.
Yes. The question was, apologies. Have you found a particular religious bias in your patients? Did Christians have a more Christian experience? Did Buddhists have a more Buddhist experience? Was there anything that came up like that?
It's really interesting, actually. That's a really interesting question. Not that there was a bias, no, but the participants that we worked with, there were many different religions, and there were also people who didn't follow any religion, you know. So I don't think it really matters. I suppose. I mean, no, I'm probably coming to that a bit too soon. Actually, I think it probably does matter. Because again, what that suggests is that actually it's your own personal relationship to yourself. So if Christianity is my thing that kind of makes me feel connected and makes me feel love for myself or love for humanity, then I'm sure that that's something that would help, you know. So I suppose it's that thing about having supporting philosophies and religions underneath it, you know. I think Buddhism is an interesting one in terms of like, you know, because Buddhists say it's like there's nothing, and I think I mean that's a bit of an oversimplification, but it's like, you know, the nothingness, and it's like, well, actually, is it about nothingness, or is it about being able to sort of step back from the ego, you know, coming back into the great, whatever you want to call it, God, nothingness, you know. So I suppose, I don't know, I think that's a really interesting question, and there should be a study done about it. We did have one guy who, just before he dosed, he told me that he was Who are the guys that come and knock on the door?
Jehovah's Witness.
That's it. Yeah, and I thought it was quite interesting that he waited to tell us until right just before dosing, because of what our biases might have been towards him. And actually we built up a relationship with him already, and love the guy. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because when you talk about Jehovah's Witness, you kind of think, I certainly think, oh my God, Lee, what are you on about? But he quite cleverly left that information out. So actually that's an interesting question from the therapist point of view. Do we have any biases, and can we step back from them and accept whoever is coming into the therapy room?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I also want to kind of plug our next talk on tomorrow, on Tuesday, because we have the Reverend Danny Nemu speaking kind of basically psychoactive substances in the Bible, and how kind of in ancient Israel, there were a lot of different substances being used in very, quote, kosher ways.
Yeah. Spiked wine, didn't they? They called it spiked wine.
Yeah. And then there was also, I mean, he's done incredible research on this, but kind of cannabis and other more complex chemistry that's going on, and it's like the anointing oil and all sorts of interesting stuff like that. So if you're interested in the kind of religious, drug-induced, kind of drug-infused bent, come again tomorrow at on 420 at, I believe he's speaking at 4 p.m. So yeah, there's going to definitely be more on that. And then I also wanted to link it to Johns Hopkins did a really interesting study where they tried to induce or occasion mystical experiences with psilocybin. And it basically worked. They showed that they could induce kind of mystical experiences, which are very difficult to define. They used a very interesting survey to figure that out, but there is definitely a connection between kind of beliefs, intense overarching beliefs, and the psychedelic state. And there are two more questions that have popped in here, so we'll get to those really quick. An off-topic question, says Hassan, but he was curious about what music was provided to the patients during their experiences.
Yeah, so we had a playlist. We had a couple of playlists that we would go to. So nothing with words usually, or if there was something with words, it would be like chanting, something that was kind of, you couldn't really understand. And we'd ask the participant to bring in a couple of their own tunes that they'd like to hear in there, but we'd put them in towards the end. So yeah, it's kind of, what would you call it? Kind of world music. There would be a little bit of chanting, kind of a bit of drumming. What would usually happen, it would start off quite soft, everything quite soft, and then it felt like some participants gave us feedback that we were trying to sort of guide them into like darker places, because every now and then you'd get a song that was kind of like, and a bit looming kind of thing, which is, it works. It helps people kind of go into those more sort of darker recesses, and then you've kind of got the cathartic release of the more beautiful angelic stuff, So, I mean, there's been discussions. I've been talking to other therapists and facilitators around this, is like what would ultimately be amazing is to have a group session and to have instruments and kind of, or even a band, kind of there creating the music, following the participants, which could be really interesting. I mean, I suppose with a group of people, it might be a little bit tricky, because you might have someone who's having an intense experience and someone who's having sort of an angelic experience, and where they kind of meet, but it feels like there could be something around live music that could be really, really useful. I think Mendel, can't remember his second name, Klein, I think, he's developed a whole system that I think is interactive. So I think there's going to be so much coming out in that area, rather than a kind of prescribed playlist. Yeah, that
might be, is that called Wave Paths?
That's it. Wave Paths. Yeah.
There's a really cool website that you can check out. I think it's also an app. It's like a kind of virtual music environment that is adjustable, and you can tweak it. It's got a very cool visualizer attached to it. but yeah, I think he did some of the playlists for some of the trials that maybe King's College did. But so one of our last questions here is we're kind of getting a little further out into the nether reaches. Have you ever worked with regression therapy into past lives with psychedelics, and what's your opinion of it?
I'm open to it. I've never gone there myself. I mean, in terms of my own psychedelic experiences, I've definitely gone there. I've experienced multiple past lifetimes
Wow.
in one moment, you know, very specific, very, you know, sort of embodied. The whole thing felt like it was going on for a lifetime. So a really interesting area. Yeah.
Wow, cool. Yeah, that there's definitely yes, many dimensions of, I guess, what would be called parapsychology. And another plug, on Thursday we have Dr. David Luke speaking about kind of things similar to this. He's definitely an expert on that. So if maybe Alexia could ask that question to him as well.
Yeah,
Thursday.
Dave Luke is brilliant on all that stuff.
Yeah. All right. So I think the last point we have here is David said, after a recent bad trip, all of my psychedelic experiences have dragged me back to a similar headspace. It now feels sensible to take a break and try to address the experience whilst not on substances.
Yeah.
Would you have any advice in addressing these recurring experiences?
My advice would be, if you can afford therapy, go to therapy. Someone who's psychedelic friendly, who can work through this with you. I'm really glad that you've come to your own conclusion about stop taking the substance to try and find the answer. I had a very similar experience myself back in the day, where I kept going back into the psychic experience to find the thing that was kind of fucking me up in the psychedelic experience, you know. And actually, I think the message is quite clear in that, isn't it? It's like, stop doing this and start having a look at what's going on internally, and and trying to do some excavation work on why you keep going back to that experience, and whatever the experience is for you, whether it's a sort of challenging experience, why do you end up back there? What is it that's kind of the part of your personality that keeps taking you back there? You know, because that's the other thing. We come to these experiences and we take ourselves with us. You know, so we take all our sub-personalities in there with us. So who knows, there might be some part of us that's kind of going, who's needing attention, or feeling left, or feeling like this isn't what I want, you know. So yeah, good work. And, you know, integration groups, journaling, all the usual stuff, you know, kind of, I think in connection with other people would really help, because you get that mirror, and it's really good to tune in that way.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks for that. Those thoughts. I really appreciate that. So yeah, I guess back to the last question, what resources would you recommend for people? What kind of maybe books have had the biggest impact on your understanding of this? And yeah, any last thoughts?
There's so many. There's just so many. I'll tell you what. I'm going to come left field here. It's not too left field, but I would say read Ram Dass's autobiography. It was released about a month ago. It was kind of finished by one of his friends, but he covers just about every psychedelic angle in that. And he, you know, but the beautiful thing about it is he takes you through his own experience of how he was, you know, he would do like a week-long psychedelic experience, redosing every 4 hours. And, you know, and at the end of that week, he'd still come down. And what I love about Ram Dass's approach is just that, you know, even later on in life, when he became Ram Dass, he'd still check in the psychedelic universe, but it was like maybe once a year or once every 2 years. And that's, for me, that feels like that, you know, that's probably about right, you know. I mean, I don't know, you know, it might be once every 5 years, but it's that thing of like approaching it when it feels, trusting when you're called to it, rather than trying to chase it, trying to find out what's going on, you know. And that just comes back to that carrot thing. It's like, we're already whole. We're already here. We're okay. So if we're coming from that space, then I don't need anything else actually, because I can kind of just look within. But with psychedelics, I think just checking in with yourself, being honest about what your intention is. What am I doing here? You know. So yeah. So I'd say Ramdas's autobiography.
Excellent. I cannot think of a more fitting way to bring this to a close. So thank you very much, Greg, for your time, and thanks everybody for tuning in. It's been a pleasure, and please make sure to check out the rest of our events throughout the week. We've got 4 more days of excellent talks on so many different things. So go to our Eventbrite link; it's right in the chat there, and get your free tickets. But yeah, thanks again for your time, Greg, and for everybody tuning in.
Thank you so much to you guys as well for making this happen. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. Have a great evening. Thanks.
Take care. See you later, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.